There's one thing that I wanted to say last week that I like got flustered at the end with so much Rambam is that, and I actually like it came up in conversation with someone who's breastfeeding currently, which is the Rambam has this idea that I think I got to it like in passing. The Rambam has this idea that that you have to, which is basically Gemara, that if mom is breastfeeding, you have to like give her more food, like you add to her mazono, and then if she wants more than that, she can like eat from her own allotment, and the husband can't tell her like what to eat. So if he thinks like you're eating something that's unhealthy for the baby or whatever, it doesn't matter because like he has this idea that like she's like the hunger makes her suffer, which is like also like so relatable because like most people that are breastfeeding are like so hungry, and that like her suffering takes priority over potentially even the health of the baby, which is like fascinating, right? Like that's language that we're familiar with like women in labor and like maybe like those like abortion or like whose life comes first, Makorot. But he uses that exact same language as like Sar Dida Kudim or something, or Sara Kudemet or something like that, which is like incredible.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, I'm gonna thank you. Hi everyone, welcome back to our third week of feeding babies from the Talmudic times until today with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. Our third week, so just a quick reminder to please stay muted when you're not speaking. I'll promote you to panelists and we'd love to see your face, but no pressure. And feel free to put questions in the chat or to raise your hands. And Rabbanit Sarna, thank you so much.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm gonna share my screen. We'll be able to look at all the Makorot together, but also Chaya is gonna put the source sheet in the chat, and we're not gonna look at every word of every source. So definitely, if you're like, wow, that sounds so interesting, I want to learn more, check out the source sheet. You can go find the full Makorot, and definitely spend some time with the source sheet. So last week we talked about like kind of like who pays for feeding the baby. Like feeding babies is super expensive, and like who is responsible, and this and from maybe like that financial perspective, then who gets to call the shots. So what if mom wants to breastfeed but dad doesn't want her to? Dad wants to hire a wet nurse, or the opposite, he wants her to breastfeed but she wants to hire a wet nurse. What if the baby already recognizes mom? Then what? Like, then can she still opt out, or does she have to continue to breastfeed even if she doesn't want to? And we saw that there seem to be times when dad gets to call the shots, times when mom gets to call the shots, and times when the baby gets to call the shots. But there's another kind of piece to all those Makorot, particularly the baby ones, which are, we have the sense, it's a very strong sense in like our culture today, but the Gemara also has the sense that breastfeeding creates this very beautiful relationship between a parent and a child, and that, like we don't want to necessarily just sacrifice that so easily. And we even saw, we're not going to look at it today, but in our first class, we saw that there was a father who, he was so poor, his wife died and he was so poor he couldn't afford a wet nurse rather. So God gave him breasts and he nursed his own baby. But we see the other man who famously nursed is Mordechai, nursed Esther in the Midrash. And again, it's sort of, maybe the Midrash maybe suggests like he couldn't find someone appropriate. But again, it's sort of coming out of that sense of like, what does it mean to like have this like lakach lo levat, which is the language in the Megillah. Like, what does it mean that they like had that kind of special relationship? Maybe that means he like nursed her, that nursing becomes this like really, really special parent-child feature. And maybe that's a piece of this conversation, and it kind of maybe lying behind the sources we looked at last week, which were very sort of economically driven. Breastfeeding is expensive. It makes people hungry. It takes a lot of time. If you're breastfeeding, you can't necessarily do all the other chores you would normally do, all of that sort of thing. But there's also this relational piece. So this week we're going to look at that relational piece. And then at the end, we're going to transition from a relational piece to, we're going to like use the same source and take it at a different angle. And we're going to, from that angle, get into the questions about breastfeeding and SNUT, which I think is kind of an under discussed question. I think a lot of people make a lot of assumptions about breasts being like nakedness. And those assumptions are based on our like societal norms, or like, oh, like you're taught, like your clothes have to cover to here and whatever. So like, of course, when you're breastfeeding, like the breasts are naked, but that's not actually so obvious from our Makorot. And so we're gonna look at some of that today as well, and we'll see, kind of some conflicting sources in that direction also. But I think, one of the big challenges with breastfeeding is that it has this amazing kind of benefit of like, wow, it's me and my baby, and this closeness and special relationship. But then there's this hardship about it. Someone in my community here in Philly was saying that for her, one of like the hardest things about breastfeeding is actually the loneliness of it, that you have this special relationship with your baby, but then because you're like exposing yourself, you end up going into a room by yourself in order to do it. And so it has that relational element with the baby, but then maybe this isolation tendency vis-a-vis other people. So that's kind of, those are the two kind of topics that we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Okay, so the first thing, this source is the one, this story about Sarah, Abraham, and Isaac is going to be, we're going to look at the same story twice, once at the beginning now, and once when we make our right angle turn into talking about SNUT. Because we're going to look at a different version of it. So just so you can kind of have a sense of how this class is going to go. So we will be returning to this story. But so what happens in the Torah is Isaac is born. And then basically the next thing we hear, Isaac is Isaac is about to be weaned. But when Isaac is born, he's named Yitzchak for the laughter. And Sarah says, like, who would have guessed that who would have said to Abraham that Sarah should nurse children? And so then, right, Hinika banim Sarah, and then the Midrash says, hold on, who are these banim? Who are these boys? What's the plural here? Says the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Kama banim Hinika Sarah. How many boys did she nurse? Amar Rabbi Levi. Oto hayom shegamal Avraham et Yitzchak beno. So the day that Abraham threw this like weaning party for Isaac, which the Torah tells us about, asa seudah. Oh, but also like the language here is so weird. The day that Abraham weaned his son Isaac, usually that's not something that fathers do, or like that the non-breastfeeding parent does. Usually that's something that the breastfeeding parent does. But anyways, right? So the day that Abraham weaned Isaac, asa seudah gedolah, he made a huge feast, hayu kol umot ha'olam merananim, and all of the nations of the world, were gossiping and saying, Ra'item zaken v'skina sheheviu asufi min hashuk. Did you see these elders, this old man, old woman? They brought a foundling from the market. They just found a kid and they took him home, and they're calling it our son. V'omrim baninu. V'lo od elisha osim mishteh gadol ha'amid divrayim. And now this elderly couple who found this child and are pretending that it's theirs, now they're throwing a big party for this child as if it's their son. As if, right? Everyone thinks, oh, they just want to have like an heir. So they just like found someone and they're pretending it's him. And now they're throwing this big party so that we'll all come out and kind of like be brought along with the story. So Masa Avraham Avinu. So what did Avraham do? Halach mean kol gadolei hador. So Avraham went and he invited all the important people of the generation. Sarah imenu zimna and Eshoteam, and Sarah invited all their wives. They had a separate men's party and a women's party. V'kol echad ve'echad hivya bana ima. And all of the women who Sarah invited, they brought their babies with them. Umenikata lo hevia, but they didn't bring their wet nurses with them. Every single woman who came to this party brought the baby, but forgot their wet nurse at home. Oh no. Ne'asan nes b'sara imenu, and a miracle happened for Sarah. Niftechu dadeha kishtei ma'ayanot. Her two breasts opened like two springs. Mehenika et kulan, and she nursed all of them. Ve'adayin hayu merananim v'omrim im Sarah habat tish'im shana tilid. But they still did not say, they were still gossiping and saying, even if im Sarah habat tish'im shana tilid, even if, okay, now we believe that Sarah had this baby. Fine, we can trust that, because if she has breast milk, she must have given birth, they imagine. Nowadays, we have ways of inducing lactation, but apparently the Gemara didn't know about that. Usually today it involves like taking some oral hormones, so it's not so crazy that they didn't really know about that. So they say, okay, so maybe Sarah could have this baby, but Avraham ben Me'ah shana yolid, but could Avraham have a baby at 100? And immediately Isaac's face like transformed into being exactly identical to Abraham's face. And then everyone patchu kulam v'amru, and then everyone immediately exclaimed, Abraham holida Yitzchak, Abraham fathered Isaac. So what I want to say here is that how do we even prove in a case where, oh, like, we don't really believe that this baby belongs to you, we think your relationship is made up? How do we prove that relationship here in the eyes of the Gemara? Sarah's ability to nurse like proves that relationship. Now, obviously, I want to say that's like a really complicated thing to say, right? Because like adoptive children are children, mothers who can't breastfeed are mothers, all of that for sure. And with all the problematics, and at the same time, there's something that is like resonant here about this, of the sense of like, oh, like how could Sarah prove that this baby was hers? Well, she was breastfeeding it, and she had this amazing magical breast like springs capability, and that showed everyone that she had in fact given birth to Isaac, and he was not just in asufi min hashuk. He was not just a foundling from the market. I do just want to note, because I think sometimes people who have never lactated don't kind of know how it works. So this idea of like breasts like springs, they don't even realize like how miraculous that would be. So just like, I feel like I probably should have like said this in the first class or something, but the way breastfeeding works is that babies or mechanical pumps of some variety have to actually like suck on the breast. Like it doesn't work like peeing or spitting or something like that, where you have kind of cognitive control over it. It's not a faucet, it's not a spring. Usually the baby like sucks on a breast, and then that causes what is called like letdown, when then there's like a gush of milk that comes out, and that's usually like quite kind of like watery milk, and then the baby continues to suck and the milk flow kind of slows down a little bit, and that's like fattier milk. That's when the baby gets most of its calories from what we might call like so there's like foremilk and hind milk, and those are different. And so like as the baby is sucking, the milk kind of transitions, but it's never just like so there are people who leak if they like go too long without nursing, or if right, the baby's only sucking on one side, but letdown happens in both breasts, then they might leak on the second side or something like that. But it's still never like a spring. I don't think that's like the miraculous part of this, like it's not a fountain. That would certainly not be like a correct biological description of how breastfeeding normally works. Okay. So now that, right, breastfeeding can be this like marker of relationship, but what's sort of the nature of that relationship? So Mara Benjamin, in her book, The Obligated Self, writes about this Gemara in Masachet Brachot. She writes about it very beautifully. And what this Gemara is the beginning of Masachet Brachot is trying to determine, like, when do you say Mariv and when can you say Kriyat Shema in the evening? And so in order to do that, they have to figure out how you tell time at night, right? So imagine you don't have a watch. And during the day, you kind of tell time by where the sun is. But obviously that doesn't work at night. So what distinguishes one part of the night from another part of the night? So we have Rabbi Eliezer. He says that there's 3 watches. So the night can be divided into 3. And that there are watches in the heavens and watches in the earth. And then he says we have a breita, shalosh mishmarot have halayla. There's 3 watches in the night. And so this is what happens in the heavens. Al kol mishmar yoshiv HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And at each watch, God sits v'shoeg ka'ari, and he roars like a lion, as it says, Hashem yimro mish'ag mimo'on kocho yitin kolo shoeg yish'ag al navehu. The Lord roars from on high in his holy dwelling. He makes his voice heard. He roars mightily over his dwelling place. The siman ledavar. And how do we know? And what's the like earthly equivalent of God roaring at each watch? What happens on earth? At the first watch, Mishmara Rishona Chamor No'er. The first watch, the donkey brays. At the second watch, Shnia Klavim Tzoakim. At the second one, dogs bark. Shlishit, Tinoki Unik Mishtei Imo. And then third, a baby nurses from its mother's breast, and the wife converses with her husband. Definitely my experience has been certainly that my babies are the earliest risers. As they start to sleep through the night, they're still like, the baby is the one that's up at 5 a.m. or 5:30. And it would be, obviously so fun if your husband would get up with you to schmooze while you're feeding the baby. I don't think that's a particularly common experience. But that's definitely what the Gemara describes. And certainly now in the winter when it's still quite dark at 5 a.m., I always think about this Gemara, and I think about how and the idea is that mothers tell time by their babies, and that the breastfeeding baby is this marker of time. And it's so funny because when you think about in the early days of an infant, you're so exhausted and you're like, what is time anyways? And the truth is that like the clock no longer rules your life, right? Like once upon a time, you're like, okay, 9 a.m. I get to work, and 5 p.m. I leave work, and then by this time 7 o'clock I have dinner, and then by 11 o'clock I go to sleep. And like when you have an infant, like none of those times, probably not when you're eating dinner, and probably not when you're going to sleep, and probably not when you're getting to work, and probably not when you're doing anything. Like the only relevant timepiece in your life when you have an infant is the infant. My husband and I like to joke that infants are just like potatoes with alarm clocks inside of them. And it's like the only relevant timepiece in your life is this baby that is screaming, I need you, or it's asleep, at which point you better like dive into bed nose first, because that's when you're going to get to sleep. And so actually for mom, like the baby really does, it takes over your life and becomes your clock. In this like really interesting way. And so that's like one piece of the relationship. And then how do we think about it from the baby's angle. So the Midrash understands, this is now in source number 3, the Midrash understands the Torah describes the man as its taste was like the sap of oil, shad hashaman. And shad is the same word for breast, for shadayim. So the Midrash understands that there's a parallel between the man and breast milk, and understands then that the Jewish people eating the man are like a baby drinking, or like a baby nursing, which is my friend Rabbanit Leah Sarna actually has written very beautifully about this, and the idea of the Jewish people kind of like being born with the splitting of the sea as like the birth canal, and then maybe if like Sinai is like the bris or something like that, right? Like coming into the covenant, but then you have in the desert, you have this nursing incompetent kind of baby of a people that are, hopefully by the end of those 40 years, reaching a certain amount of like ability to exist on their own, maybe. So anyways, you can look up Rabbanit Leah Sarna. It's on Feller. You can check it out. It's a beautiful article. But so this Sifrei describes almost like from the baby's experience, what is nursing. So ma hadad hazel tinok ikar v'hakol tfeilalo. So just as the breast is primary to an infant and everything else in the world is secondary to them, so too, the man was the main thing for Israel and everything else was secondary to it. So then it has variantly, Devar Acher, Ma hadada za afilu tinok yonik himenu kol hayom kulo ve'ino meziko. Just like a breast of an infant, this is a cluster feeding infant. It's feeding all day long. There's no person who breastfed who doesn't like so like reaction to that midrash saying that. Like I feel just that like for sure this midrash like was either written by a woman or someone who knows what she's talking about. Right, this right, baby, you can suck all day long, and and it doesn't hurt the baby, right? If I ate chocolate all day long, I would have a massive tummy ache. And somehow babies, they manage to just nurse for 24 hours straight, sometimes it feels like, and that doesn't hurt them. So to the man, even if the Jewish people eat from it all day long, they would not be injured. Just as breast milk, that it seems like it's all one thing, but actually it has like all these different flavors. It has foremilk, it has hind milk, like it has variety to it. So too, the Midrash understands that man would change according to whatever like flavor people were hoping that it would have, and that's why they tell women maybe like, or in the times of this midrash, they would tell women like, oh, don't eat garlic or don't eat onions, it's not good for the baby, because like the food you would eat affects the breast milk kind of outcome, which is we think that's still true today, that like that's how babies kind of like get a taste, their first taste of like spicy food or whatever, like different like cultural foods. Babies get those flavors through the breast milk and then are kind of ready for them when they have food for the first time. And then lastly, just as the breast, the infant suffers when it withdraws from it, so too it was very hard for the Jewish people when the man stopped falling. So they had to like adjust to actually working, and you can see the book of Joshua for that. It's like a very sad moment when the people are weaned in Joshua 5. Okay, so that's the like special relationship from the baby's perspective. So from the mom's perspective, it's like time. Everything is about like I'm setting the clock by this baby, and from the baby's perspective, it's everything. This is the only thing they want in the world. It's everything they dream about, and everything when they wake up that they care about. Certainly for babies of a certain age, obviously that changes. Okay, so that is special relationship just in general. But now the question is, all right, so as we've been discussing, people since time immemorial have struggled to breastfeed or have not wanted to breastfeed. So now we've set up that breastfeeding is this like very special relationship. Why is it that in order to like kind of like get out of that relationship, all you have to do is be able to afford a wet nurse and then you can buy yourself out of it? Like, shouldn't it be actually like, shouldn't we be like more discouraging than that? Like, shouldn't we say, no, like if you are the mom of this baby, you should like try and provide the manna directly from you, right? And definitely like in America today, there's so much pressure in that direction. And we really didn't see that last week. Last week we saw it was like an economic decision only. So how does this play out in wet nursing? Do we really not have any kind of hesitations about just transferring that special relationship to somebody else? So the answer to that is we do have hesitations and we don't have hesitations, and it's quite actually multivocal on that front. So here's our first example of a faux wet nurse in Tanakh. Right? Bat Paro thinks that she is hiring a wet nurse when, right? So Moshe was sent into the Nile by Yocheved, by his mom. Paro's daughter spies the basket amongst the reeds, sends her slave girl to grab it. She sees the boy. She recognizes that it must be Me'olitei ha'Ivrim, right? She recognized that it must be a Jewish boy. The Tomer Achuto, right? Miriam was standing there watching. She says to Bat Paro, should I go find you a wet nurse from amongst the Ivriot? Now, remember, and I mentioned this, I think 2 classes ago, that wet nursing in societies that have slaves is often the job of a slave, right? In America, that was a huge component of kind of the female slave experience was wet nursing for the like white babies, and you can really imagine that basically being like, if you were Bat Paro, you would not be like, oh no, like my baby must be nursed by an Egyptian. Like, no, of course, probably all Egyptian babies were nursed by these women whose babies were thrown into the Nile, right? The babies were murdered, and then the women are still lactating. Perfect, you'll nurse the Egyptian babies, right? Like, you can really imagine that. Now I gave you something to say at your Seder in a few months. You can really imagine that being a piece of the Jewish enslavement in Egypt. And so this conversation seems like it would have been like pretty obvious, like, oh, should I go find you someone? Just like if you had your own baby, probably you would have gotten a Jewish slave to go be their wet nurse. And Bat Paro says, yes, go. And Miriam goes, and she finds her mother to nurse the baby. And then when when the baby grew up, it was brought back to Paro's daughter, who at that point, right, that's kind of interesting, right? Vehila Leven, only once Moshe was weaned, which is, and we saw it last week, right? Maybe that was like age 4 or 5, probably more like age 2, because Bat Paro probably wanted him back. But right, it's like a while. And at that point, Vehila Leven, at that point, Moshe becomes her son, and only at that point does he actually become Moshe, which is interesting. Like, Bat Paro kind of like saves the baby, sends him off to a wet nurse, and he doesn't. It's not like Yocheved comes to live in the castle. That's really not what it seems, or the palace, whatever. It seems like the baby Moshe went to go back and live with his mom. Thank you, Miriam, for facilitating. And then baby Moshe, only once he's weaned, goes to live with Bat Paro. And at that point is when she actually kind of fully adopts him and takes him in. Okay. So the Midrash here loves this. Right, quotes the pasuk, should I go find Karati l'cha isha mineka min ha'ivriot? And the Midrash says, Umay shna me'ivriot. Why would Paro's daughter specifically want a nurse of the Hebrew women? And I laid it out like, oh, in slave societies, the slaves are the wet nurses, just like we saw in the Gemara, right? That if you can afford a servant, then the servant is a wet nurse. But the Gemara doesn't have that assumption, and in fact uses this as an opportunity to share the following story. It shows that they brought baby Moshe to each and every potential Egyptian wet nurse. Velo Yanak, and Moshe rejected all of that. Amar, because baby Moshe, said to himself, Pesha atila daberim hashchina yinak davar tameh, a mouth that in the future will speak with the divine presence should nurse from something that is impure, i.e. a non-Jew. And then it says, this is right, it picks up on this beautiful pasuk from Isaiah, at mi yored de'ah b'chulei, l'mi yored de'ah, l'mi yavin shmu'ah, ligmulei mechalav l'atike mishadayim. So the prophet asks, like, whom shall one teach knowledge and whom shall one make understand the message? Right, and then the Gemara understands that to be knowledge of the Torah, message of the Torah, and the verse continues, them that are weaned from milk, them that are drawn from breasts, meaning that the breastfeeding relationship is a Torah relationship. And this language, by the way, of Yored De'ah is often called Yoredeya, right? Alternatively known as a section of the Shulchan Aruch. And like, it's kind of amazing actually to know that this section of the Shulchan Aruch is named after these verses from Isaiah that are in a way about breastfeeding. So like plot twist, things people didn't pay attention to or don't really know. And so the Gemara understands that here we can read the Rashi at mi yorad de'ah l'mi limid HaKadosh Baruch Hu Torah. Who is Hashem gonna teach the Torah to? L'misha gamal v'yifrish atzmo mechalav tamei v'ne'atak min hashadayim hatmeim. So the one who separated himself from impure milk and fled from impure breasts. So here we have, the Midrash doesn't just imagine like, oh, Miriam volunteered something convenient that like anyways kind of made sense to Paro. Here we have Moshe going on strike. No, I will only drink kosher breast milk from, my mother, the Tzadeket Yocheved, says 3-month-old Moshe. Which is kind of amazing. And definitely, like you hear these like Gedolo stories of like Torah women who like I feel like I heard about someone, I'm not going to say who it is just in case I'm wrong, who like while she was nursing her babies like learned all of Torah Tamima, or Alana Kershan has written quite publicly about like learning Daf Yomi while she's nursing her babies. And I feel like that's really like a cue of this idea that like, yes, like the breastfeeding relationship is this like almost like Torah relationship. It like prepares a baby to like receive the Torah, and that's why baby Moshe had to be so particular about from whom he was going to nurse, up to and including like who his wet nurse would be. Like baby Moshe was himself particular about who would wet nurse him, because he was like, this mouth is going to accomplish something in this world, and that means I can't just be nursing off of anyone. It needs to be kind of someone who's going to prepare me to be the vessel for the Torah. So that's definitely kind of one perspective. There are other perspectives in the Gemara. We're going to look at two more. So here we have the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. This actually makes sense Avodah Zarah as a locus for this conversation, because Avodah Zarah is all about relationships between Jews and non-Jews. So Mishnah in Avodah Zarah says, Ba Yisrael, I'm in the underlined part here, Ba Yisrael lo tanik b'na shelo bedet kol chavim. So a Jewish woman cannot wet nurse a non-Jewish woman. Aval ovedet, a non-Jewish baby, which is like kind of funny because like theoretically that might be what happened, right? If we think of Moshe as Bat Paro's baby, then like Yocheved was a wet nurse for a non-Jewish woman, but maybe, Moshe, so like a Jewish baby. Anyways, that's like kind of interesting that you have like a Mishnah coming in to maybe almost like critique Yocheved agreeing to be a wet nurse for this non-Jewish woman. And we'll see the Gemara about why that is in a second. But aval uvedet kochanim menika b'na shel Yisrael. But a non-Jewish woman can nurse the baby of a Jewish woman birshuta, on that woman's property, or like in her presence. Okay, so that's really interesting. What's going on with that? So here's the Gemara. Rabbanan Ba Yisrael lo tanik b'na shelo bedet kol chavim mipnei shemegadelet ben la'avodat kol chavim. So a Jewish woman cannot nurse the baby of a non-Jew because you are raising a baby who's going to grow up to become an idolater. Like you're essentially raising an idolater. That's a problem. We don't want you to do that. So you're not allowed to do that. That's like a really interesting idea in general, because like, what does it then mean if you're like, I don't know, like a Jewish nursery school teacher for like non-Jewish babies? Like, is that allowed? Is that different? Because it's not like your body. And you could say maybe it is, right? That maybe like the nursing relationship is what's so special, and what so like implicates you as a potential wet nurse. But giving a baby a bottle in a nursery school maybe doesn't. Maybe it's a different relationship. I don't know, whatever. We don't need to like go into that, but just like interesting to kind of like think about the practical ramifications of that. But here's why. Okay, so the first thought in the Gemara is not the Mishnah. So Ovedet kol chavim lo tanik et b'na shel bat Yisrael. So the first thought in the Mishnah, the first thought in the Gemara here, which is this Breita, says that a non-Jewish woman is not allowed to be the wet nurse for a Jewish baby, because we think that the non-Jewish woman is going to kill the Jewish baby. She is suspected of bloodshed. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's what Rabbi Meir says. Chachamim omrim, but the sages say Ovedet kol chavim menika et b'na shel bat Yisrael. But the sages say, more in line with the Mishnah, no, a non-Jewish woman is allowed to nurse the baby of a Jewish woman bizman sha'achirot omdot al gaba, so long as she is being watched, so long as there's like a mashgiach, aval lo beino levina, but not in private. And Rabbi Meir slaps back. Rabbi Meir says, "Afilu achirot omdot al gaba nami lo." He says, no, even if someone's watching, still not dezimnin de shaifala samaladad me avrai uchatzalai, because she could smear poison on her breast if she can leave the house, put poison on her breast, come back in, nurse the baby, and no one will see anything, and she'll still have successfully killed the baby. So Rabbi Meir says you cannot trust a Gentile wet nurse with your baby. She's gonna kill your baby. Whereas the Chachamim say, no, you have to like take precautions, but you can have a non-Jewish woman nurse the baby potentially. So that is so far we've seen two perspectives. We saw the perspective from Moshe, who just says, I don't want to have this type of relationship with someone who's an idolater, to here where it's like the idolater maybe will kill the baby. So that's what we're worried about. And now we're going to see a third perspective from Masachet Yevamot, where we have a breita that says, Yonik tinok veholich mi goya umi behima tamea. A child can nurse from a Gentile woman. So the difference here, like it seems like there's an obvious like stira almost between the Gemara in Avodah Zarah and the Gemara in Yevamot. the Gemara in Yevamot is kind of like from the child's perspective. Like it's not a problem for the child to do this. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah is more from this like the adult's relationship perspective. Like there's more adult involvement, it seems like, in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah than in Yevamot. Anyways, obviously like Rishonim go to town and halachic sources go to town on like how to navigate these different things. And where the halacha ends up is you're permitted to use a non-Jewish wet nurse, but you should really try to use a Jewish wet nurse. So just to look at a source from Ashkenaz and a source from Sfarad. So here's the Ramah. And I love that the Ramah, they know the story of Moshe is in their head because they call a non-Jewish wet nurse Chalav Mitzrit, right? Not any kind of Gentile, an Egyptian Gentile. And like the Ramah is sitting in Krakow, right? It's not like, oh, in Krakow, all the wet nurses were Egyptian, like doesn't seem very likely to me. Okay, so the Ramah says, Chalav Mitzrit Chalav Yisraeli. He says the milk of an Egyptian is the same as the milk of a Jewish woman. Oh, by the way, I should mention, like, where are we in Yoreh De'ah? So this is actually like about like the kashrut of human milk. That's like what the Siman is talking about. But it says the Ramah, he says if you can find a Jewish wet nurse, you should use a Jewish wet nurse. Why? Because the milk of idolaters will make the heart of the baby stupid, and it will put into him a bad nature. And similarly, a Jewish wet nurse needs to like only eat kosher food. And there's like the commentaries on that. I'll explain that like what we're talking about is, let's say you have a Jewish wet nurse who has some kind of like health issue and therefore she's allowed to eat something not kosher. The Ramah says, okay, well, even if you have to eat something not kosher, you shouldn't then be a wet nurse because the non-kosher food is going to like come out through your breast milk. And similarly, a baby himself shouldn't eat something non-kosher because it'll all come back to harm him in his old age. That somehow this like non-kosher food, it causes, or non-kosher breast milk or breast milk from a non-Jewish woman can cause like spiritual harm to the baby, says the Ramah. And this is why there's actually a thing like some people even today, if you ask like, oh, my baby's in the NICU and like I don't have enough milk, so like I'm having donor milk, right? There are some people who would say, do you have like Jewish donor milk? Like that would be my preference, to have donor milk from a woman who is kept kosher. Like there is such a concept in the world as like kosher donor milk. But usually that's like not really an option. And usually if you're getting donor milk, your baby is like in trouble. And at that point, like unless it's like there's like some obvious way for how to get like kosher donor milk, you should be giving your baby whatever the right milk is that's going to keep them healthy and available. Anyways, always happy to chat with people offline about the realities of that some other time. But anyways, here's just like, there becomes this idea, and you can tell that like the Moshe story is kind of playing heavily in people's heads, as opposed to, right? But like what wins in the eyes of the Ramah? Because in the Gemara and Avodah Zarah, we're worried that the wet nurse is going to kill the baby, the non-Jewish wet nurse. And that's not what the Ramah is worried about. The Ramah is worried about this like spiritual harm, which is much more that Gemara and Sota, the Moshe Gemara. That's really where the Gemara is here. And the Ben Ish Chai, just to show you like a Sephardic source who says, something very similar. So even though, and he calls it chalav nochri, like just a normal non-Jewish woman, not a mitzri specifically, like the milk of a non-Jewish woman, even though it's really halachically exactly the same. If the baby needs a wet nurse, you should really like, you should work to find so that your baby won't have to nurse from a Gentile, because, and he uses this exact same language, mitamtim halev birat shamayim molid ben tavara v'achzariyut, that it makes the heart stupid and kind of blocks off the fear of heaven, and it puts in a bad nature into the baby, and it gives the baby like cruel, achzariyut is cruelty, cruel characteristics. So take it or leave it. But definitely this becomes like this kind of strong narrative, that like that Moshe narrative more than the Avodah Zarah narrative seems to really kind of like take the day here in a way that's sort of interesting. Okay. So now I told you we were gonna come back to that Sarah story. And now we're gonna say, now we're gonna talk about Sneed. So this is an amazing version. We saw before the Gemara's version of this story. Now we're going to look at the Breishi Rabbah version. So they say, Henika banim Sarah, Henika ben inktiv kan. So it says she nursed sons. It doesn't say she nursed one son. And then they say, Imenu Sarah haitatz nu'a yoter midai. Our matriarch Sarah was overly modest. Amar la Avinu Avraham. Avraham said to her, Ein zo shat hatzniut. This is not the time for modesty. Ein zo shat hatzniut. Ella gali et dadich. Reveal your breasts, so that everyone would be able to see that God had started doing miracles. I love that idea. Abraham says to Sarah, this is not a time for modesty. I think that is such an important and super difficult phrase when it comes to breastfeeding. And I know that that's like something that happens a lot of moms, like you give birth to your first baby and you're in the hospital and you're like, your body is just like out all the time. You're just like naked all day long. Like, wow, I used to wear all sorts of clothes and now I am not. And all these people are coming in and they're poking and they're prodding and they're trying to help and they're touching you. And you're like, and also like, society doesn't tell you that you're sick, right? You're like, oh, but theoretically, like I'm healthy, maybe. The halacha thinks you're sick. I always like to remind people that for the first 7 days postpartum, like halachically speaking, you're like on death, you're like at death's door. So just because America doesn't think you're sick doesn't mean that that's correct. Anyways, for like this idea of like there's a time for tzniut and there's a time that's not for tzniut, ein zo shat tzniut, I think is like a really helpful, and imagining Avraham Avinu as the one saying it, I think is like a really helpful language for that experience, that a lot of women who their whole lives like wear clothes and all of a sudden like your clothes are always in the way and you're always like, what is happening here? I think that's a very helpful midrash. Okay, so now the question is like, are breasts actually nakedness? So here's a Gemara in Brachot. This is about David HaMelech and all the different songs that David HaMelech sang. So one of the songs is Yanak B'Shtei Imo. He nursed from his brother's breasts. V'nistakal b'dadeha, and he looked upon her breasts. V'amar Shira, and he sang a song. So right, the song is Bless the Lord, O my soul, do not forget all his benefits. Gimulav. The Gemara says, what is kol gimulav? What is all of these benefits? Amar Rabbi Abahu sha'asala dadim b'makom bina, that God placed breasts for women in the place that is the source of her understanding, i.e. close to her heart. Tamamai, what's the meaning of this? Amar Rav Yehuda, kadei shelo yistakal b'makom erva, so that the baby would not be looking at the place of his mother's nakedness. Rabban Amar kadei shelo yinak b'makom hatinovet, so that the child would not be nursing from a place of uncleanness. So here's what this means. If you've ever milked a cow, you know that, or a goat or whatever, like, you know that their udders are very close to their genitals. Whereas for women, our breasts are not particularly close to our genitals. And here the Gemara is saying, wow, what an amazing, unique thing about women that our breasts are further away from our genitals than other animals, so that when the babies nurse, they're near our hearts, which is what the Gemara understands to be the makom bina, the place of understanding. And that's what, again, this ties into that special relationship of breastfeeding, and breastfeeding as a way of transmitting knowledge, of learning your idea. And for my purposes here, though, I want to show you that this Gemara and Bracha, it's distinguishing entirely. Breasts are not erva here. In fact, we're celebrating that breasts are separate from the place of nakedness. Breasts are somewhere totally different from the place of erva, says the Gemara in Brachot. So that's one position, right? That's one Gemara that says, yeah, breasts, totally not. Erva is your vagina, and breasts are not even close to it. Breasts are close to your heart. They're an extension of your heart. Okay, that's one position. Here we have a Gemara in Gittin where we have a supposition that by Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir has come a few times tonight, and usually he's not the like crazy strict one, but tonight for some reason he is in my like cherry picked Rabbi Meir sources. But here's Rabbi Meir saying, now we're in Gittin, and we're in parts of Gittin where that's giving like reasonable reasons for divorce. And here we have like a woman who is very licentious. And how do you know what are examples of licentiousness according to Rabbi Meir? A woman ate in the marketplace, walked with her neck stretched forward, or nursed in the marketplace. So the Chazilai Katanai, Katarai, Achla Bashuk, Gergara Bashuk, Hinika Bashuk. Beklan, Rabbi Meir Omer Tetzei. Rabbi Meir says you can divorce all of those women. So my point being, Rabbi Meir is imagining that nursing in public is grounds for divorce. And eventually Rabbi Meir gets shot down. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, if those are grounds for divorce, there won't be lo hinachta ba'ala Avram Avinu sheyoshavet tachat ba'ala. You won't find even one woman who's like still married to her husband, if like that's sufficient grounds for divorce. But you have this opinion by Rabbi Meir that says, yes, like nursing your baby in public, that is licentious behavior. Whereas previously we just saw, no, like the erva is just the vagina, and this is totally different. Okay. The Mishnah and Chala lines up much more with the Gemara and Masachet Brachot. The Mishnah and Chala imagines, so it has this naked woman, Haisha Yoshevet V'Kotza Chalata Aruma. She's sitting and she is separating Chala while completely naked. And the reason why she can do that is a naked woman who is sitting down can be sufficiently covered. The Rosh Mishatz understands that she is sufficiently covered just by having her vagina, like by crossing her legs or by having it be in the ground, that she can make bracha. Mevarachet lahafrish chala min ha'isa. That's the bracha you make when you take chala. You can, she can say the name of God completely naked because her vagina is covered while she is sitting. So that would be again evidence that breasts are never nakedness, regardless of like what you're doing with them. So that's the Mishnah and Chala, that's the Rosh Mishatz. And here again, we're going to see in Shulchan Aruch that we're talking about making brachot, and the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch says how dressed do you have to be in order to make brachot? So it says If you're naked, you shouldn't make a bracha naked until you cover your erba, until you cover your genitals. But what are we talking about? What are we talking about? We're talking about a man. About isha, but a woman, she can just sit down. And by sitting, she will kind of have de facto covered her nakedness. And again, what that means is that a woman's breasts seem to not be considered nakedness yet again. So we saw kind of this outlier Gemara in Gittin that does say breastfeeding in public is naked, but for the purposes of davening, of making brachot, breasts are certainly not considered nakedness for the purpose of like, wow, am I exposed to my baby? Like, no, that's not considered naked. So it actually, like, I might have wanted to say, oh, it's this like special relationship, like ein zo shat hatzniut, what Abraham says, like this isn't a time for being particularly covered up. Like this is a time where your body actually like changes, your relationship to your body changes. And yeah, ein zo shat hatzniut. On the other hand, maybe our normal tzniut standards are just not like reflective of actually what halacha thinks tzniut is, that actually you could daven completely naked. Says the Shulchan Aruch, says the Gemara, says the Mishnah and Chala, and that erva for women is actually kind of just the vagina, potentially, and not the breasts. So definitely, there's plenty of halachic literature, which we're not going to have time to go into, about can I nurse? Can I daven while I'm nursing? And certainly in those early days where you're nursing around the clock, like the Midrash described about the man, if you don't daven while you're nursing, you might not find time to daven at all. In which case, you certainly you should do that, and maybe even it's beautiful because maybe the point of nursing is that it's close to makom bina, right? It's close to the heart, and it's close to this place where Torah and where a relationship with God can come out from, and that can be passed on to the baby. And at the same time, this idea of like, oh, you can't, this voice of it's licentious to nurse your baby in the marketplace, and that actually while it might be while your relationship with your baby is flourishing, it does cause this other kind of social isolation. I think that's just like very true to a lot of people's experiences. Even if you could kind of convince yourself that your breasts aren't nakedness, our society certainly kind of like thinks they are, and halachically, societal norms around nakedness carry halachic weight, I should say. So it's not to say that like, oh, like our practice comes from nowhere. Like, no, societal norms are our practice. And that's very much reflected in the Gemara and in the Halacha. And we didn't see that inside today, but maybe for another time. So it's not to say that it's wrong, but it is something that's very hard. That on the one hand, like ein zo shat hatzniut, this is a time for our bodies to really be going through this transition and to be kind of exposed in different ways, and on the other hand, like exposed around whom and where in different ways, and all of that I think is extremely complicated and difficult, and people like have different all sorts of different feelings about that. And I would say norms are in some places are slowly changing around that, and those norms will then in turn kind of affect some of those ideas of tzniut, because tzniut is a little bit culturally contingent. But anyways, so just to recap in the last minute, today we saw that I'll stop sharing my screen. Today we saw some really, I think, quite beautiful sources about how there's this special relationship formed between baby and mom, and then how breastfeeding also kind of like says something about that relationship to the world. That certainly was the case for Abraham and Sarah. And then how then that special relationship is so potent that maybe that in turn means there's ideas about being careful about where the baby's nutrition comes from, potentially in terms of like who's going to feed the baby and noticing that that relationship is important. One thing they say when you are looking at a daycare is like, find out whether they do propped bottle feeds, because like those are dangerous or whatever. And so like there's one reason to not want a propped bottle feed because it's dangerous. And the other reason is because like you want, when your baby's eating, for that to be a source of relationship for the baby. And I think that those halachot about like being really cautious about, who's going to be feeding your baby. Is it going to be safe? Not to say like all Gentiles are baby killers. No, like of course not. We would never say something like that. But the Gemara in Avodah Zarah does say something like that, more or less. But definitely, right? So like, is it safe? Babies that don't get proper nutrition can die. Babies can choke on their own kinds of nutrition, right? All sorts of stuff in that direction. But also like, is it going to be loving? Are babies going to learn the right kind of wisdom from that? Is it going to is it going to train their soul in the right way, right? Like that's what happens when babies are eating. And so, and I think, nowadays we would certainly say like, you can imbue all of that to your baby via a bottle feed, but definitely, like that is kind of a vote in the direction of like, stay off your phone a little bit while you're feeding your baby. Obviously that's super hard, but like give your baby that kind of attention, because they really are learning by watching you. And so if you're thinking about like, what do I want my baby to see when they're watching me, I think that's like a really important and really valuable thing. And that the idea that then in terms of what part of your body they're seeing is that what they're seeing is the makom binah. They're seeing kind of the heart of wisdom and intellect, because breasts are in the top half of our body and not the bottom half of our body like animals. I think, there's something very beautiful about that. So anyways, that was for this week, special relationships and nursing and how that plays out in different ways. Next week we're going to talk about Shabbat. So the other thing we talked about this week a little bit was kashrut, right? So we covered kashrut tznius. Next week we're going to talk about Shabbos. Next week we're going to really talk about some very like issues that people find quite pressing. So if you have friends who are like, I have to pump on Shabbos, that's what we're going to be talking about next week. But we're going to see that it's not as like modern an issue as some people think. And next week will be the last piece of the series. So come back, and thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna. Do we have time for questions? Should we give a minute, or
are there questions? I didn't. I thought people would like raise their hands if there were.
Oh, often we just give a couple of minutes at the end.
Yeah, we can totally do that.
Anyone? Okay, we are past time, so yeah. I was comment from me, but when you're talking about the woman waking up early in the morning and maybe talking to her husband, I was thinking of, there's a Sylvia Plath poem called Morning Song, which she wrote about the experience of waking up super early to nurse a child. And apparently I studied it with my English professor last year, and apparently she wrote a lot of her poetry in the early morning while nursing her baby, like alone in that solitude. And that's where a bunch of her poems came from. So that's a fun fact. Yeah. I mean, some of the poems. Anyway, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna. I want to let everybody know about our upcoming Bohm Memorial Lecture, which this year we're going to have Rabbi Dr. Ariel Evan Mays on the topic of Judaism and the environment. So please check that out at Bohm, which is bohm.drusha.org, and go to drusha.org for all of our other offerings. Finishing up Fall Zman, lots of exciting things going on. So thank you so much for joining us, and see you next week.